Thank you very much, and good morning to you all, and thank you very much for this warm welcome. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to give the keynote speak at this conference. We're going to speak to the title of Infrastructure, Power and Social Change, and use a number of examples from my forthcoming book, Mobility and Justice by Design. In today's talk, I'm going to speak about infrastructures, but not primarily. I'm going to speak about the lives lived within infrastructures as my main concern, and I'm going to speak particularly about marginalized groups of people, which I think is an interesting and politically and normatively very important dimension, but also a way to understand infrastructure and the way in which infrastructure affects our lives. So I want to talk about the ways in which infrastructure lays out the conditions of our everyday life and our abilities to move and not to move in the cities and in infrastructural systems. So I just need to my machine. Getting to that, I would propose as an attunement to look into some of the examples of experiences with infrastructure lives where we find challenges, where we find that people are engaging with the way in which infrastructures have been laid out and constructed and designed, but from the point of view of trouble, from the point of view of challenges, from the point of view of enacting some sort of resistance or countermeasures to the infrastructures. For instance, you could find online Disability at Home website where, as the author of the website argues, ingenuity and creativity that caregivers and disabled people have to perform to make home accessible. So this idea that you actually are meeting a world that is designed and made and created and crafted, but it doesn't fit the ways in which you can engage and fulfill your potential as a human being. So how do you deal with that? You have to counter it, you have to challenge it, you have to redo it as a way. So I'm interested in this sort of vernacular counter design made every day by millions of people all over the world within infrastructural landscapes that challenges and try to make the infrastructures fit their bodies, their cognitive and physical capabilities as best as possible. Another example would be the website on care tactics, where you see the argument that is made that disabled people develop and share hacks. So this idea of hacking the infrastructure, this idea of redoing or amending the infrastructures on a daily basis, I think it's a window not only into how marginalized people feel that they have to counter the infrastructure, but also what is the normativity, what is the ideas and rationalities behind those infrastructures. So this is based on this idea that we are all living infrastructured lives. Artifacts, technologies, spaces, tools affords our relationship with the world and each other. But at times, such affordances are compromised and social participation is curbed, intentionally or unintentionally. Vulnerable cities must pull off very hard work to make the world habitable, and they suffer often from mobility and justice by design, which is what I'm targeting in my work. So this is sort of the in-flight. This is how I want you to think about infrastructures as not just the hidden substratum and what makes lives and worlds tick, but also how people increasingly are feeling challenges in the meeting with these infrastructures and how they can actually counter some of that. So let me give you some examples, but before that, I want to talk a little bit about the framework, how I think about this whole field, and what are the kinds of, in my opinion, adequate theoretical framing tools that we need to apply in order to unfold our analysis of these phenomena. So I'm thinking very much around, of course, mobilities, design, but also embodiment, multisensorial engagement, capacities, the ways in which that we are inhabiting these infrastructural spaces, both for those who are able, but also particularly for those who are not able to enjoy the full potential and idea behind these infrastructures. And one thing that I'm interested in speaking a little bit about, which is also a major concern in the book, are the ways in which exclusion comes about. Sometimes by intention, sometimes unintentionally. In previous research on exclusionary design targeting people in homelessness, I've been working a lot with intentional exclusion, how people, unhoused population and people in homelessness are deliberately being excluded from public spaces. So there's a clear sort of idea of intentionality. But I'm also interested in the unintended consequences of design when they lead to exclusion. And of course, by volume, this is much, much larger. Many more people around the world on a daily basis unintended consequence of design and also of exclusion. So what I'm speaking of here is the intended exclusion by designers, for instance, in this device that you find in many public places, a metal artifact placed on a bench for the purpose of preventing people from lying down and sleeping there. So that's deliberate. There's no one that can argue, this has happened by mistake. This is very clear sort of intentionality. But also, and I was thinking what would be a nice example, but this is a classic example. This is the Apple Arts. There's been redone the diagram, but it's basically about the number of interactions across a street space when compared to a very high traffic, medium traffic, and light traffic. And what you see the account of is what many traffic engineers and transportation planners name barrier effects, right? So the infrastructure makes a barrier for people to interact across the street. Now, this is not a sinister plot conceived by infrastructure planners and traffic engineers to prevent people from meeting. This is an unintended consequence of the design, that you actually have a consequence where more people feel that they're not able to cross the street. And you could find the same type of argument, same type of thing when you look at light crossings, intervals and time for senior citizens, when you don't really have short periods of green light to exclude senior citizens from public spaces, but the unintended effect would be something like that. So that's going to be a very important sort of distinction. And of course, there will be gray zones where the intentionality dimension can be, you can argue that can be much more complicated to talk about. And coming from that, I also just want to make a few remarks on infrastructure. Infrastructure as such is not a big part of the book that I'm referring to as such directly, but indirectly, definitely so. And I'm very inspired by Susan Lee Starr's classic piece, The Ethnography of Infrastructure from 1999, in which she argues for a call to study boring things. Many aspects of infrastructure are singularly unexciting, she argues. They appear as a list of numbers and technical specifications, or as hidden mechanisms subtending those processes more familiar to social scientists. It takes some digging to unearth the dramas inherent in systems design creating, to restore narrative to what appears to be dead lists. The unearthing of the dramas is what I'm looking for. I'm trying to understand how we can rethink our perspectives on infrastructure in light of these discussions. Conventional view of infrastructure renders it a system of substrates, background invisible and ready to hand. Whereas Lee Starr's perspective, and mine as well, is more relational view, looking at the performative, active, and agency of infrastructures. And I think there's a particularly interesting call or methodological recommendation in Lee's work when she talks about infrastructural inversion. So foregrounding the truly backstage elements of infrastructure. And I think that's really what, in hindsight, when I'm looking at the research I've conducted for the book, that I'm actually looking at. I'm sort of trying to make infrastructural inversions by looking at how infrastructural spaces and systems are designed for able bodies, for people with particular capacities, and how that is experienced by people who do not have these capacities. And by throwing light on that, you will actually have some level of infrastructural inversion, as it were. And related to this, I'm very interested in the whole agenda raised by Nick Scheller and other people on mobility justice and how it connects to care, the whole conversation about care. This is a quote from Berlingeri and Swanen arguing that adopting an ethic of care as a framework for justice implies a decisive move away from distributive or liberal approaches to justice, seen as right versus wrong, towards a situated discussion of how mobile moral subjects are constituted, and the imbricated nature of movement, bodies, gender, environment, and energy. The central question becomes how to care optimally for the mobility needs of the most vulnerable and for the non-human environment in an ongoing collective and reflective process. And I think the notion of care and related to mobilities research is very important, and also something that we can actually look to, for instance, thinkers like Tissot, who argues that on the most general level, we suggest that caring is viewed as the species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. I think that's a really important thing when you think about infrastructure and infrastructural spaces, to maintain, continue, and repair a world that is actually livable as best possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, and all of which seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web of the program. Part of this discussion of infrastructure and care and justice has also led me in the book and in my work to rethink and maybe recalibrate the perspective from justice towards injustice. There's a long and complicated literature on that, but I just want to point to a couple of places. Sklar argues that justice radiates no emotional appeal. The value of justice lies, after all, in impartiality and the universality. Injustice, on the other hand, is effectively rich in a way that doing justice is not. And it's not meant to be. Injustice, to put it in another way, is felt and necessarily particular and partial in a way that justice is not. Injustice is passionately felt. Or as Jung argues, injustice is not recognized by appealing to universal principles to actual situations. Rather, ideas of justice appear as the result of an articulation of a sense of injustice. Or as Barnett argues, in Honnett's view, if recognition is a condition of identity, then experience of disrespect associated with feeling of shame, anger, and indignation are fundamental to the political articulation of injustice. So I'm looking at the ways in which we can think about how the way that infrastructure and design landscapes address us as human subjects carry connotations of acceptance or disacceptance, and the normativity embedded into these systems. And I think that the way in which we tend to talk about mobility justice as an act of distribution of goods can also be inversed when we start looking at how it feels if you're on the receiving end of injustices, or how you think about the ways in which you meet these systems when you are a disfavored mobile subject, as it were. So what I'm arguing is that injustice is also a feeling, and that we need to add to the notion of mobility injustice the lack of resources and opportunities, that mobility injustice is also an effect, an emotion. So I want to suggest that we are not just looking at injustice as a redistributional matter, but also looking at it as an experiential dimension to our lives. That it's not just a matter of access, but also a matter of affect. And that being rejected by infrastructural landscapes and spaces that are designed is on a very profound and human level, something that is registered and in a much deeper sense maybe than whether you are feeling that you're having your just distribution of the societal cake, so to speak. I want to return to Michelle's work here, because a very important part of at least my work is also to look at the embodiment and the bodies. And in her work, Michelle argues that the problem of mobility injustice begins with our bodies, and the ways in which some bodies can move more easily through space than others, due to restrictions on mobility relating to gender, race, class, ethnicity, sexuality, and physical abilities. Second, mobility injustice concerns the shaping of the environment by uneven infrastructures and land use, including the forms of buildings and streets, vehicles, public transits, and other forms of transport infrastructure that have long been part of the making of racially segregated cities, sexually unsafe areas, or places of class exclusion. So again, this attentiveness to how injustice meets the body, mediated through the ways in which the spaces are designed in an infrastructural sort of sense. So that agenda hopefully is fairly clear. So what I've been interested in some of my work with both empirical people, also from looking into other people's research, is then how people who are suffering from these injustices are meeting those challenges. What are their approaches? And I think there's a rich culture and literature as well for looking at the resistances, for looking at the counter practices, for the counter ways in which you can target these injustices. And of course, this all has to do with this idea that there is a complex relationship between us as species and the environments that we've been creating. There's an intertwined, complex, and circular relationship between us as human bodies and the material environments wherein we exist. So we are enrolled and related, but not separate from our environment. But it also means that someone somewhere has decided how these habitats and environments should materialize and manifest themselves. So I think these results of design decisions and design practices needs to argue us for understanding not only what design is and what it does, but also how it's working, sometimes counter to the widespread cultural belief that design is always doing good, that design is always benevolent. So looking for how these counter practices emerges in spaces and landscapes where injustice is felt and experienced by people, and how they can actually try to counter them. And the literature is rich on this, and I wanted just to draw in a few to your attention. This is Sarah Hendren's eminent book, What Can a Body Do? And in this book, Hendren argues that in the late 1960s, disability activists were rumored to have poured concrete to smooth the passage from sidewalk to street in a DIY editing of the city. It was a hacker-style approach to creating the conditions of the future. Others took more forceful tactics, smashing concrete curbs away to create cuts required in a guerrilla-style street activism or action. So this idea of challenging, redoing, and countering the already existing and laid out landscapes suggests windows into the action potential of people suffering and feeling these injustices, but it also speaks very much to the normativities that are already embedded and invested into these systems. A central concept in that conversation is the notion of affordance. James Gibson coined the notion many years ago. It's been redone over time. Jenny Davies, my own work on it. And the basic idea, of course, is that affordance is a relational concept. So it has to do with the relationality between the acting body, human or non-human, and the environment. So looking for action potentials, like when I went down the slope here, it was a bit slippery. So I was looking for how can I walk without tripping? How can I do these sorts of things? What are my possibilities in these spaces? So affordance is a very crucial way of reading the landscape, of understanding the world that is laid out in front of us, looking at our own capacities and our capabilities, assessing on the fly what's the right way to do things, how do we get around, what's the appropriate thing. However, that also connects to this whole idea of counter practices. There's a really interesting work done by Aseli Dukomachi in this book, Activist Affordances, in which Dukomachi argues that as a disabled person, you are constantly redoing, you're constantly challenging, you're constantly hacking or working on the affordances laid out in front of you in order to make it fit. Dukomachi speaks in this work about shrinking affordances, or shrinkage as a term for describing the diminishing action potential does a disabled person experience when, for instance, trying to button a shirt, if you have serious condition of arthritis, or if you're trying to face stairs and you're a wheelchair user, or you're trying to find your way in an environment without having visual capabilities adequate enough to do so. So this constant redoing is an everyday feature of people in these conditions, and I think it speaks volumes to how we should think about infrastructure and injustices in our understanding. Also, I'm inspired by the work of Sarah Mead when she talks about queer use. So queer use might refer to how things can be used in other ways than how they were intended to be used, or by those other than for whom they were intended. So this idea that all design, all layouts of the world comes with this sort of script, this ideas for adequate actions. Sometimes you can redo those things, you can repurpose these sorts of things, you can re-articulate the ways in which you want to apply or use those infrastructures or those technologies. So in the book, I'm trying to make this argument that by looking at mobility as my key interest, I'm trying to get injustice, design, and bodies to interface in this framework that enables me to make an analysis of the everyday life within different particular groups. In the book, in the work, I'm working particularly on people in homelessness or unhoused. I'm working and talking about disabilities and aging populations. And obviously, sometimes these are overlapping. You can actually belong in all three categories at once, but for the sort of purpose of the argument, I'm separating this into three areas. And so I want, in next bit of this talk, I want just to dip into some of the voices and the empirical accounts for how this actually feels. How are the experiential dimension expressed by these people in case. So I'm looking at the living of infrastructure lives under particular conditions. Doing my work on the exclusionary design with people in homelessness in particular, I came across about 10 years ago a quote from a person in The Guardian that has stayed with me ever since, and I want to share it with you. And it goes, it's Entr'acte that argues that from the ubiquitous protrusions on window ledges to bus shelter seats that pivot forward, from water sprinklers and loud music to hard trouble arrests, from metal park benches with solid dividers to forest-pointed cement bollards on the bridges, urban spaces are aggressively rejecting soft human bodies. We see these measured all the time within our urban environments, whether London or Tokyo, where we fail to process their true intent. I started scanning my surroundings with the distinct purpose of finding shelter, and the city's bark cruelty became clear. So this particular person has suffered a social event, I think is what some people call it, moving from a well-earning position into becoming a street sleeper and homeless person, and only then started to see how the city is actually rejecting, how it's made, how there are different interventions made for people not being able to sleep in particular spaces, for not being able to be present. And so I think it's very profound that the human space is aggressively rejecting soft human bodies. That's what we are. We're all in these soft shells, and we're moving around in the environments and the infrastructure landscapes as best as we can. And particularly these groups are attentive to how the city is actually not accommodating their presences. I want to move on to another account. This is from a person, a wheelchair user, and facing the convoluted exercise to get from where to go. In this respondent, Nettie, which is an anonymized person, says that, has it got a train station that got a lift? Are the lifts working? And so wherever you go, you've got to plan if the lift is working or not working. So if you got to do this convoluted exercise to go from where to go, pretty chronic. There are a couple of places where I've been going regular a few times where you get stuck. So this idea that, your travel might stop when you leave the door. If you're a wheelchair user, your travel starts way before. Your travel also is extended in time much more because you have to take into account where are the infrastructural spaces where you will be in trouble if you get there with your wheelchair and so forth. Another example from a senior citizen arguing that the sidewalks here are deteriorated and very uneven. The cracks make it difficult for me to walk. See, I'm walking on this part of the sidewalk to avoid the big cracks. Since I use a little shopping cart as my walker, my cart will get stuck on the crack. I have to go around it. I have to be always looking down and finding paths that's even so my cart doesn't get stuck. And the headline here suggests that further on the interview he talks about the presence of cars as another obstacle and another challenge to her ability to move in the city. In the book that I've already mentioned by Dokumachi, there's several examples of the counter practices, and I thought this one was particularly interesting in a mobilities context. And the quote is, Anna explained to me how the affordances she had invented for being able to press the gas pedal more easily when driving which she did two-footed, an automation gear. And I found a concrete block and placed it on the car's floor. It kind of helps me keep my foot up a little higher because I can't really push it with my toes. So this idea of taking a concrete block into your car to actually redo the affordances created is, of course, not necessarily something that you would recommend from a point of view of the automobile security, but it's an interesting example, I think, of the everyday hack and the way in which you can counter these systems. Another account, which is the account made by Recalvelo in Hacking the Underground, which is about the disability infrastructure in London's public transportation system. Here's a quote from an interviewee that says, well, we made our way to one of the train platforms in Richmond, where Yvonne unfolded a lightweight ramp Alan carries on the back of his wheelchair. She confidently placed it at the train doors when it arrived so that Alan could board. We can't ask for the ramp here, Alan told me after we settled into the seats. So this idea of bringing your own ramp as a remedy to the existing connectivities in the system is another way of showing how you have to be constantly working your way around the infrastructure and how you have to redo it and remake it in a certain sense. Okay. I want to then draw the final example, which is maybe a little different. This is actually from the special issue just come out on detours. And together with a colleague, Carsten Nielsen, and we did the research on people in homelessness on the streets. And there was a particular interesting feature when we were talking to people in living on the streets about how they would move around in the city, how they would make sure to engage in appropriate spaces. This is a quote from a homeless person in Aarhus, in Denmark, and he says that when we come down from there with so many vulnerable homeless people, when we walk up through the city or the train station or something like that, we often encounter old school teachers and others we know. And it's embarrassing to be completely wasted or half drunk on pills, So we use the detours. We call them the back streets, The vulnerable and homeless people in Aarhus use back streets. When I walk down there in the morning, when I used to go down to Vejhus Forbi, which is the equivalent of the big issue, in the morning, I would meet 4, 5, 6 people going the other way. Some of those already have been to the addiction center to win and pick up their medication. I just don't feel like encountering the world. So this idea of redoing your routes to not make these uncomfortable encounters, to look out for the safe routes or the less conspicuous places is another way of redoing or at least challenging the main ideas of the infrastructural landscapes laid out in front of us. Okay, so let me just recap very briefly. I want to suggest that the ways in which the infrastructural landscapes are laid out, of course, has repercussions for all of us, but for some people in particular, there are challenges that they are constantly trying to engage. And those challenges and the way in which they engage them, the counter activities, the hacks, whatever you want to call them, speaks to the normativity installed and vested into the actual systems and the ways in which the user is imagined, the sort of imaginary mobile subject that has been imagined to be present in these spaces. But I think it also speaks a little bit to the way we can think about what to do about it, and how we can maybe unfold a different perspective than just the taken for granted perspective. So I want to entertain that a little bit in this last couple of minutes of my talk. So trying to think ahead. I'm very inspired by the call to engage the kinopolitical, as Scheller argues. So she questions, how can we challenge kinopolitical constellations on uneven mobilities or mobility regimes in ways that might entrain greater mobility justice and enable us to imagine different planetary futures? And one of the ways in which I've been inspired to work with the infrastructural spaces and the way in which we are enrolled into these kinopolitical constellations has been through the works of the late Bruno Latour. Latour argued in a now rather famous talk to the Design History Association back in 2008 that, quote, to define humans is to define envelopes. The life support systems, the Umwelt, that makes it possible for them to breathe. We are enveloped, entangled, and surrounded. We're never outside without having recreated another more artificial, more fragile, more engineered envelope. We move from envelopes to envelopes, from folds to folds, never from one private sphere to the great outside. So what I think is on the menu here, or the agenda, is that the artificiality, the madeness of the landscapes, the spaces we inhabit, is a condition, it's a ground condition. It is what the planning theorist Arthur Escobar argues an example of ontological design. But Arthur argues that we rarely think these days about the ways in which our lives are thoroughly designed. It's a sedimented and thus invisible history, yet no less effective because of that. Or you could say, again, as I had, the famous quote by Churchill when raising money for the rebuilding of the Parliament, that first we create the buildings, then they create us. Or as Tim Minchell argues on the cover of his new book, your life is manufactured. In other words, design creates people in the world, and that comes with ethical obligations. And this is where I want to go with my reflections on how we can think about these sorts of things. So I think there's an argument to be made and a way to think about design. And I'm not speaking about, so if you are a transportation engineer or a computer coder or whatever, making these spaces, and you think, oh, it's not talking to me because it's talking to designers. I'm thinking very broadly about design. So all these elements are made, they are designed, they are complicit in the way in which we can feel about our ability to fulfill our human flourishing potential. So I want to think a little bit about made, remade, and unmade. Because if our environments and spaces, things and artifacts, technologies are made, they might also be remade or even unmade. So, of course, there is a vast durability, there's a vast staticness. There's a lot of money, a lot of concrete, a lot of technology tied into these infrastructural landscapes. That makes a redoing not an easy task. But I think it's impossible. It's very important for us if we want to talk and challenge about the potential to have a more human flourishing existence and a less exclusionary existence in these frames, that we don't take them for granted as simply there, as second nature, as something there. And this is why I think Latour's call for understanding how the artificiality of our infrastructure landscapes is very important. So the world could be different. It's contingent, and herein lies design's transformative potential. The activist hackings and counter-design practices of disabled, suffering, exclusionary ableist design is both a window into the powers and normativity of ableist design, as well as they may be forerunners and role models for transformation. Dokumachi argues in her book on activist affordances that we need to make livable worlds for refused bodies. And I think one of the ways to do that is to rethink the way infrastructures are conceived, and to understand their artificiality also means that there is a contingency, that they can be challenged, and that many people all over the world every day, from the perspective of disabilities or other perspectives, are actually doing that on a daily basis. They're challenging these ideas, these structures, these technologies, these landscapes. Yes. Most of what I said is embedded in this book, Mobility and Justice by Design, which hopefully, God has promised me that, should be out on January 23. And there is more depth to the argument. There are much more casework. There is much more the voices that I've only giving you a little flavor of today, and within the time confinement of this talk are more elaborated and unfolded in that book. So if you're interested, you can find more there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We will now have about a 20 minutes Q&A session. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and our staff will bring the microphone to you. And for the online participants, if you have questions, please use the raised hand function.
Thanks very much for the talk. I wonder if you could say a few words about, I guess, the inverse of what you did say. So I'm struck by the idea of soft bodies and hard landscapes. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how infrastructures are also designed for privilege for people who are on the other end of the spectrum you're talking about.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you very much. And yes, that's of course a very obvious and important question. And I think that in the work I've done just here, I've focused on the underprivileged, or people with sort of are not enjoying the full potential of these sorts of systems. But definitely, I'm very interested in the. There's the whole line of research around the super rich and this extreme sort of accessibility. I'm very interested in. Very often we actually see in design terms, and I'm thinking broadly about design now, I think you see a lot of ingenuity, a lot of innovation, and a lot of inventiveness in terms of making quicker, faster, more secluded spaces and routes like premium access, different types of technologies, different types of software filtered, ways to enhance the mobility and capabilities for those with who either have mostly it's economic resources, but it can also be cognitive resources, or it can be other kinds of resources. So I think actually the reason why I've chosen to look at the other end of the spectrum here is because that is part of where I'm sort of interested to go with my question about injustice. But of course, you could argue that most of the favoritism of those systems right on the backside of this favors, right? And there's a whole research, and I know some have already present in this room have done research on some of that, but I mean, there's the whole, there's a class dimension, there's a whole service sector dimension to those who make that thing run, right? To enable the seamless travel and mobility and the privileged journey for some, there's a hard material labor at the other end or on the backside, and that would also equate to the Star argues for the infrastructural inversion, right? So definitely you could do stuff there. In this particular research, I've been deliberately focusing on the other end, but I definitely agree that it's very important, very interesting, and some research is done, but those absolutely are.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Well, great talk. You had a quote, I think it was from Nietzsche, which said mobility justice begins with our bodies. And what I was thinking about there and struck by was what our can mean there, and that tension between injustice to do with individuals and to do with categorizations of groups, and how often exclusion works to broad brush categorization of huge groups of people. It's my desire to others work on this. And I guess I was thinking about what modern technologies, the rise of AI, might be doing there without making that worse or better. Because I guess one is a point Nigel Frith made many years ago, which is with the rise of big data, the dream is that actually you have what's called calculation, the calculation to so phenomenal, using such huge quantities of data that you're able to drill down to the individual, make qualitative distinctions using big data. So I guess, do you see things, where is the hour in this? Is it that what's happening with that tension between the individual and group categorizations? And where do you think things might be going with the rise of things like big data and AI?
Yeah, thanks. That's really good question, and I think that there's two levels to it, at least the way I think about this. There's the violence of categories, basically, and how we utilize them. Also in our critical research, but still are utilizing them. And of course, there's some interesting work by disability scholars right now around the violence of categories, basically, and how and also the whole question of intersectionality, which is something I'm only addressing a little bit in the book, and definitely one of the points of critique that you could argue, you have to be more careful about that. And the big question, of course, when you talk about technology then is whether you are able to, a bit like medicine, could customize and individualize, you can target, this idea that because of the vast amount of data, you can actually not just think about things in big groups, but you can actually customize things to the level of the individual, right? Could you imagine that AI and big data would make it better for us to customize solutions for people in these spaces? I mean, one of the problems, of course, is that we're talking about material infrastructures, and they're kind of hard to deal with, to customize so that they will work explicitly for you. I mean, you can imagine digital world being, much more ephemeral and fluid and plastics that you can actually mold and form them into your image of your needs, right? Where it's harder with the built environment and the infrastructures. That's actually why I'm looking a little bit. I didn't talk too much about that here, but I'm looking into universal design as an interesting way of thinking about thresholds for access, right? So if we lower the threshold so that a wheelchair user can use the space, I can use the space as well, right? So that's half, that's the way, one way of thinking about that. But of course, if you're thinking about technology specifically and on AI and big data, I think there's some really, really interesting questions to be unfolded. I was coming across Constanza Chock's work on design justice, and in the book on design justice, there's a sort of an autobiographical account of how to be profiled in a non-binary gender person, how to be profiled in a system that are filtering people by gender, right, in the binary category, and what violence and injustice that sort of reacts and infects on Constanza Chock. And so, could you imagine that you would have systems where the categories would be more open to a plethora of ways of being? Yes, you probably could, right? If you think about that, the actual account that was given in the book, it was about security check-in, right? So which falls in the binary male or female category, right? But how then you lead a protocol and a whole sort of way of engaging and thinking about what would be the adequate behavioral response to a third or fourth or fifth category subjectivity, right? So I think there's in some aspects, like in medicine, I think you can actually think maybe on a more positive note that this will actually enable people to do more, or enable researchers and designers to target things in a more accurate way for the benefit of everyone. And then of course there are the other, and I think that the whole sort of obduracy of hard infrastructures makes this individualized customization almost like hard to imagine, right?
Thanks, Ole. Congratulations. Very exciting and important work. I guess this is a bit of a pragmatic question. I'm interested in hearing your reflections on the political risks of diagnosing and affirming inventiveness, repair, hacking, improvisation. Does it absolve some institutions of the responsibility to intervene? So diagnosing inventiveness over just contents, impossibilities. So the question is, what are the implications of inventiveness?
Thank you. I mean, that's a really good question, and I think you can respond to that in many ways. And well, I would like to think of it in two layers, right? Because one would be if you are sort of embracing the DIY and the hacking thing as, oh, then it's good, then the job's done, right? Then I would, because I sense the sort of the critical subtitle to your question, right? And I totally agree that would be the wrong way to go, right? So what I'm trying to do here is not so much to celebrate inventiveness, but I'm trying to look at what are people actually doing on the ground. While we speak and talk about justice and stuff, people out there, they can't wait for that, right? They have to make things work on a daily basis, right? But I think it also means that it is, the way I read it and the way I like to think of it is actually that some of those counter practices are tiny little suggestions or in space thoughts about what would we need to do if we wanted to change this on a more political note. I was inspired a bit by Entr'acte argues about molecular politics, thinking about the little challenges. And I think the hacks are not so much, for me at least, to say, oh, so they can fix it themselves, we don't need to do anything about it. It's more like, okay, so here are the first bake notions of what needs to be done, basically. I'm not saying that everybody should carry the ramp. That's a silly idea. But if everybody has to carry a ramp, maybe it's because we are missing ramps, right? So you, of course, have to make the right inferences from those observations. But I totally agree with you that if this focus on the DIY and the hacks and the sort of counter practices is utilized for normalizing and sort of smoothing out the way we think about the current state of affair, then I think that's a bad way of thinking about it. Right? I like to think of them as on two levels: windows into the normativity embedded into those kinds of systems and infrastructures. And we are talking about how we unearth and how we open up the black box and basically, right? And so these would be and on the second level, actually, these are tiny little suggestions or pointers towards a political agenda of redoing things, right? But I know you can interpret it in both, but I like to stand for the latter interpretation, please.
Well, I'm John from I was thinking about what you said about activists acting for conflict and direct adverse sides. But I also thought about, looking at the use criminalization of direct action in the UK, for example, the Palestine action. So they're criminalizing even these small kinds of manifestation, discontent with the environment. So won't such activists design initiatives in the name of justice, like direct action, potentially not also be labeled terroristic in the future?
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant question, and I think this has to do it has to do with the ways in which a lot of this infrastructural capacity is deeply connected into either large corporations or nation states, right? So these are critical infrastructures, and so as soon as you start challenging infrastructures, you also challenge a system or a larger agency, and they have responses for that, right? Either criminalization, labeling. Coming back to labels, labeling your activity as terrorism is already unlocking very specific legal opportunities in most nation states' legal systems, right? And at least in Denmark, we have special. So as soon as you move from ordinary crime to terrorism, it becomes a state matter. It becomes much more urgent and much more serious. So the response protocols built into the systems when you are violating or challenging or wrecking any of this infrastructure is, of course, a really, really interesting question. I don't have, in my own research, I haven't, been able to sort of come up with a sort of a response to that. But thinking just on the top of my head, I think that it is a really good example of what are the risks that you would then expose yourself to if you start challenging some of these systems. I think also, I presume many people know much more about this than I, but some of the counter practices towards facial recognition systems, with the masks and all that stuff, suddenly you become subject to, subversive activities by challenging these sorts of systems, right? And I think there's a lot of deep ironies in this. Way back in the book by Kitchen in Dutch, Code Space, they talk about non-presence is also presence, right? That you would notice these activities. So if you're not online and you're not sort of leaving traces, then it's conspicuous. And of course, if you're masking yourself, it's conspicuous. So what are you trying to hide, right? And you have, in the name of anti-terror engagement, you have a lot of what used to be former sort of ordinary civil sort of resistance practices, like covering up your face or doing particular things, are now making you subject to a very special category of legal engagement that takes you from crime into terrorism, which is so. There's this. I think what I'm trying to say is that there is a potential for the system to up the countermeasures to such a degree that people will start, feeling very anxious about actually doing these things, right? And that might even count for the little things like smashing up curbs or doing these sorts of things, which of course, it's like graffiti, right? It's violating public property at times, but it's crime. It's not terrorism. But if the content of your graffiti has a political statement, it can suddenly move on the other side, and then it's a sort of an escalation of the response from the system side. So I think those are really good questions, but I'm sorry I don't have research-based inference to talk of it.
So we will take the last question. Oh no, we have more time, about 7 minutes.
I read there was a explanation about the caravan. Quite I have a question. Why should we use the caravan to explain injustice and oppression?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Why should we use the notion of caring to explain the injustice?
Why should we use the term or the notion of care to explain injustices? I think what I'm inspired by in the literature on care and the whole idea of care is that it speaks to the way in which we think about, for many people, and I guess this is part of why we're together here, is to talk about infrastructures, right? And for many people, these are hard technological engineering things, right? And so thinking about care in the context of that might seem a little weird and odd. But my argument is that it's not, because those infrastructures and those technologies and those systems are about human flourishing. Why do we have them? We have them so that we can build better cities, better worlds, better life conditions for people, right? So the way in which we're able to move around in the city, for instance, is not just a matter of getting from A to B. Actually, I think this is the whole point about the mobility's turn way of thinking, that it's much deeper. It has to do with the values of being human, of the ability to connect to other people, of being a socially engaged person. And if you're in a wheelchair or you're a senior citizen and you can't go to the other side of the city, something is wrong. And actually the infrastructure works counter to the care. So I think we should, and caring is also caring for the planet. Caring is for the non-human species. Caring. So I think by inserting that conversation into the infrastructural conversation, I think it allows us to talk a little bit more directly about some of the unspoken dimensions of infrastructural and infrastructuring life that I think we need to as well. I'm not suggesting that any transportation engineer needs to think hard about care, but I do suggest that any transport engineer's work affects care, affects the ability to care, and caring is a super important relation. So a little bit like I would like you to think about affect and emotion when we talk about justice, and not just about giving you so much resource and me so much, but also how does it feel to be misrecognized by system, right? That's an affectful, emotional thing that runs deep. And my interviews with people in homelessness suggest that it's not just about not being able to find a place to sleep. It's about feeling that the city doesn't want you, that it's a citizen denial dimension, right? And so the way you design benches, the way you organize and orchestrate public spaces is, of course, about enjoying the life between the buildings and the urban life, but it's also about how do you welcome people, how do you dismiss people, how do you accept them or not. And so a little bit like that, I think also in infrastructure, care is absolutely vital for our understanding of what are we doing, what are the kinds of effects that our infrastructures have in people's lives. So I think there's a lot of arguments for care.
And we're questions? Yes.
My question is folded into a lot of the other questions. Some of the answers there already. I was thinking about like a person that a group to consider society itself. So thinking that social to in the project of design infrastructure, although they like silent or invisible activists in the process. I was thinking of some of the pragmatics of the responding to heads and taking care of these heads. I don't know whether it's fair to say that some of these only can be exception because society as a whole has changed towards accepting some of these other groups. For example, the aging, right? So because a lot of societies are aging, that the consciousness of the ability to be affected by the vulnerability of Asian people then becomes more conscious and therefore trickles down to the designers. Whereas when we talk about the homeless, society as a whole is not receptive. Their heads,
subject to further with structural type.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether some of that design and justice care is kind of also moving a tandem with society at large. Society is very big, right? It could also be like a village park that calls the shots, for example.
Yeah.
So, I wonder whether it's a spot.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really really interesting and important points. When I was when I was doing my research on people in homelessness and doing public talks as well, one of the things that I realized when I talked to citizens and high school students and was that people all came pretty much with this pre-assumption that design is good, right? That design is benevolent. And that has actually put me into, I mean, there's a lot of research into the gloominess and the dark sides and sinister dimensions of design, of course, because a lot of the ways we inflict violence on people is design as anything else. So what I'm thinking of here is that the normativity embedded and related to design, of course, has something to do with the wider societal values and norms, right? And so in an age where more aging populations are present, maybe, that, I mean, in Denmark at least, senior citizens is a major political force, right? So any politician with a little bit of, understanding of reading the map will soothe that part of the population, right? So they have a lot of voice, they have a lot of, still, when we talk about hard infrastructures, a lot of that is already there, and it's a hard transition to make that more inclusive, right? But I think you're right in saying that maybe what happens is, of course, that and I think that's why I'm interested in this idea that design is good, right? Because we need to move on a societal level also to talk about what if design is not good, then what? What are we going to do about it? And can we look into different areas where they have noticed that? Because if someone noticed it, it's for sure, people on the street and people with disabilities, they've noticed it all their lives, right? So society to incorporate that sensitivity to how they feel about these injustices is the next thing that we need to do, I think. And there, yes, you're right. Some have an easier political sell than others if they are, like a demographic larger group or whatever. That's true.